This is our usual image of drill instructors: loud, angry, and impatient. Now sometimes it's all with a greater purpose, other times it's just unnecessary cruelty. But the image itself is ubiquitous in military media. So when it comes to our portrayals of the long 18th century, and specifically the British Army of the century's later years, is that image still historically accurate? Or are characters like Sergeant Lynch merely an imposition of modern concepts onto the past? Well, in this video, being a follow-up to my previous discussion of how new recruits were first trained in this time period, we're going to look at the different roles of drill instructors as well as their most desirable qualifications, and ultimately, as well, their reality on the ground. Remember that if you'd like to learn more about this topic, alongside the hundreds of other videos I have on this channel, you can always visit nativeoak.org, where you can read all of the primary sources that I pull from for this video absolutely for free via our digital library. Now we're going to have a brief sponsored message before hopping right to it. Hey, Native Oak, Brandon here. What if this video was sponsored by CuriosityBox? Which is a science-y, mathsy themed subscription box by the people over at Vsauce. That's the weird intro there. Curiosity boxes include all sorts of amazing puzzles and experiments and gadgets and other STEAM-related content for adults. Take a look at some of the items I just got in my own Curiosity box. We have these snap bracelets that you never want to leave the present temporal reality without, a measuring tape that can measure time alongside distance, as well as my very own Mr. Wiggles Goofy Giggle Jiggle Siphon Straw set, which I've always wanted one. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a straw that also acts as a siphon. The box also came with this fun little time travel media t-shirt, and the thing that I most enjoy from it is this beautiful coffee table book about animal architecture and how wildlife can alter the environment around itself. It's filled to the brim with just beautiful color photography and fascinating details about every piece. Every item in your Curiosity box comes curated by real scientists, and alongside representing great reading and activities, puzzles, conversation starters, and even just simple party tricks, well, they also make for wonderful gifts this rapidly approaching holiday season. Unlock your curiosity today by following the link in the description down below, where you'll even get 25% off of your first box. Thank you so much to CuriosityBox for sponsoring this video, and now I suppose it's best we get back to our drill, lest the Sergeant Major come round. If you saw my last video about the training of recruits during the long 18th century, you'll remember that, unlike today, there were no centralized army boot camps or formal training regimens. Rather, nearly all of the recruitment, outfitting, and preparation of soldiers was being handled at the regimental level, and as such, the quality of those preparations could vary pretty dramatically depending on the context. You know, a drill sergeant for the Guards in London is going to look very different than one on garrison duty in the West Indies. Even the roles for drill instruction themselves were somewhat informal postings, being duties and obligations tacked on to an otherwise regular NCO, to make them not merely into corporals and sergeants, but drill corporals and drill sergeants, the same as there were quartermaster sergeants, or of course, sergeants major. These were jobs given to a rank, yes, for which a man might be given an additional stipend, but they were not independent ranks unto themselves. And if you're not familiar, incidentally, with the baseline operation of NCOs in the early modern era, well then I'll be sure to link a video that I have about that below as well. Now again, this isn't a formal standard, but broadly speaking, you might expect drill corporals to be responsible for those initial drills of lesser complexity, the individual movements of the manual exercise, for example, whereas drill sergeants are going to take command over larger bodies of men to drill them in the platoon exercise, the firings, wheeling, different marchings, things like that. Now, how exactly they would all go about such, of course, was up to personal and regimental discretion, although some military theorists, like the Earl of Cavan in his 1776 book A New System of Military Discipline Founded Upon Principle, would propose more formalized structures with specific tiers of duties to be performed and how soldiers would be measured in their success before graduating, moving on to the next level of training. Of course, books like Cavan's were prescriptive texts, not descriptive, and they weren't applied evenly across the entire army as policy. It's much better to think of them as one officer's idea of what best practices are. Some regiments might affect those ideas, and others might leave them by the wayside. It all depends on how forward-thinking your officers are, and of course, how well-read they are. But despite all of this informality and the variety that one might expect across an army, still there were consistent ideals behind these semi-formalized training roles. To identify oneself as a drill sergeant wasn't a nonsense term. It would still mean something from regiment to regiment and convey a roughly similar sense of importance and professionalism. In the same way that, if you were a teacher, even in a world where there were no central education authorities to enforce standards, communities would all still expect you to know the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic, because that's what makes a teacher. Although the means of the actual instruction might vary from teacher to teacher, there are still going to be commonly accepted principles that your employers, in that case a community, would more or less expect you to follow. And it's going to be pretty similar for these sorts of regimental jobs. It's not like there's a standardized set of qualifications, but from regiment to regiment, they're all doing basically the same thing, and as such, there are common principles. And to that end, it's worthy of note that when military theorists and officers were writing about these roles, they often did so in very similar language. Again, they're all describing the same basic ideal to perform the same basic function. So let's look at how a few of the biggest names in the world of British military treatises were writing about this topic. And remember that if you'd like to read any of these sources for yourself to check them and get further context, you'll find them all free of charge over at nativeoak.org. First, we'll go back to the Earl of Cavan. While he doesn't say much about the drill instructors themselves, he does offer some insights into the kind of character he expects from them before going more into the niceties of the job itself. He recommends of the drill instructor that no pique or prejudice appear in his censures, in order that justice and duty may approve his proceedings, and prevent his recruits from early imbibing any malignant spirit of murmur and discontent. And that he do upon all occasions make himself an example of order and punctuality to his men, and admit no freedom or intimacy between him and any one subordinate to him, and to never admit the least encroachment of those subordinates to him upon his authority. In short, he describes a drill instructor that is fair, but firm. Nothing too surprising in that. Moving on now to the 1779 publication that we all know and love, the military theorist Bennet Cuthbertson, in his Interior Economy of a Battalion of Infantry, he has more to say on the necessary qualifications of these all-important NCOs. The sergeants and corporals who are appointed to instruct recruits, he describes, must not use too much severity with them, lest they should be disgusted with the service. It requires a great share of temper and coolness to lead them on, and break them of their awkward, clownish ways. When that is ineffectual, and a man appears perverse and obstinate, he must be reported to the adjutant, who will give the proper directions for breaking such a disposition. Likewise, when it comes to the very first stages of a recruit getting his uniform and equipment, Cuthbertson urges the NCOs to take great pains to teach the recruits to dress themselves like soldiers by the gentlest methods, which will imperceptibly steel them into a liking for the corps, against which they might soon be disgusted if at first treated with too much severity. A coolness of temper, treating recruits gently, and if a guy just really doesn't get it, well, then you're not going to have him whipped on the spot, but you seek advice from your superior, the adjutant, to make sure that a full conversation is had about how to best proceed. This is hardly the image of a tyrant. It's hardly even the image of what many would presume makes a good drill sergeant today, with all the yelling and intimidation and happy birthday Jesus and all that. Now, some of these elements might be rather surprising to us, but it seems like they were quite common to military thinkers of the late 18th century, where kindness and patience were really being emphasized as ways to endear men to military life, helping to raise them up to the standard and giving them a certain sense of pride in taking on soldierly airs, as opposed to the, again, more modern and certainly much fetishized approach of breaking the recruit down and thence remolding them. Cuthbertson wasn't alone in this either. Looking next to Thomas Symes in his Military Instructor for the Non-Commissioned Officers and Private Men of the Infantry, also published in '79, he describes how both drill corporals and sergeants ought to be men remarkable for their expertness in performing every part of the manual exercise, firings, maneuvers, marchings, and wheelings, etc. They should have a command of speech and give their instructions with clearness and firmness. They should be mild in disposition and free from moroseness and ill nature, a stranger to hatred and a friend to the recruit. As they must expect to find many young lads awkward, careless, lazy, and in want of memory, there certainly are very disagreeable circumstances to those employed to teach them, and must often ruffle their tempers, but the only way to reconcile these difficulties with affection is to be cool and patient, to instruct them in an obliging, good-natured manner. At the same time, they must encourage an opinion of respect and obedience, which every recruit must be instructed to have for their officers. Nor was this rhetoric being limited to just pure theory and armchair generals, but the sentiments were common enough to be held even by the likes of the old Prussophile veteran General David Dundas, and he's a man responsible for a massive series of army reforms during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, they, of course, being the very tail end of the time period that we're discussing. In his widely influential book, Principles of Military Movements, which, incidentally, when compared with the proposals of certain other men like Lord Cornwallis, are typically held as being much more conservative in terms of military practice and military principles. Well, in this 1788 book, he writes about how those responsible for handling and drilling new soldiers must allow for the capacity of their recruits, be patient and not rigorous, where goodwill and attention are not wanting. Quickness is not to be required at first, it is the result of much practice. The recruit must be carried on progressively. He should comprehend one thing before he advances to another. So overall, the idea of a drill instructor in the 18th century seems to be a very different cut than what we might have expected. It's also worth noting, however, that the baseline of what constituted fairness and cruelty in the early modern world was very, very different from what it is today. It was, after all, a time period where beatings were common across every part of society and could at times be considered a light punishment in comparison to caning, in the military flogging, running gauntlets, or of course outright being hanged, shot, or even more creative and worse ways to execute a man. Violence was a major part of 18th century life, and a drill sergeant who only slaps his men around a little bit might be considered exceptionally fair when compared to those who resort to their fists. One can also imagine how easily even an average drill instructor could potentially abuse their enhanced authority, thus, practically every instructional guide really emphasizing how important it was to avoid those characters who would be prone to such abuses. Just as much as those books are all speaking very highly of the ideal drill instructors, they could also be rather condemning of the reality. So, what did the situation actually look like on the ground? Well, in order to explore that question, we need a different kind of resource. So now let's look at some memoirs that were written by the soldiers of the time about their own individual experiences. Remembering that, as before, you can find all of these books in their entirety for free, nativeoak.org. Our first account actually comes from an officer, as George Bell recounts his very first days as an awkward young ensign in his book Rough Notes by an Old Soldier, published 1867. So, emphasis on the old part, because he's describing his years fighting Napoleon at this point. He doesn't give us too much to go off of, but when he first joins his regiment, he does speak to how he went to drill under the command of an old sergeant, and how that sergeant was very kindly to him, and used to say that he was preparing me for a great general someday, if I didn't fall on the bed of honor before my time. Although, naturally, yes, a sergeant's treatment of a young officer is going to be very different from the common soldiery, and later on in the account we get a very different image of recruitment and training. Our ranks were filled up by officers and men, all Johnny newcomers, he describes, but were soon drilled into a new form of discipline which rather astonished some of their backs. They were men, chiefly volunteers from the militia, who seemed to have had a little too much of their own way, but that was soon drilled out of them, and they were taught that the first duty of a soldier is to obey orders. Now that's a curious turn of phrase, astonished their backs. Does that mean what it sounds like, that these recruits were suffering heavily under the lash until they learned their place? I don't know. I'd want to see more examples of turns of phrase like that before I said anything definitive, because I don't think it's a one that I've seen before. But overall, well, it isn't exactly a warm-hearted, kind image like what we were describing earlier. But that is, of course, still an officer's account, which, while helpful to our cause, isn't quite sufficient to understand the world of the common soldier. Of course, the majority of privates would never write down anything of their experiences, much less pen entire narratives for us to go through and study. And of those very few who did so, even less of them seem to have said anything at all about their time as recruits or their experiences with drill instructors. One of the very few cases I could find comes from a uniquely emotional and quite severely melancholic narrative, The Journal of a Soldier of the 71st, published 1819 by an author who purposefully hides his name. He writes of when the severity of his mistake in enlisting really was starting to hit home. Now I began to drink the cup of bitterness. How different was my situation from what it had been? Forced from bed at 5 o'clock each morning to get all things ready for drill, then drilled for 3 hours with the most unfeeling rigor, and often beat by the sergeant for the faults of others. I, who had never been crossed at home, I, who never knew fatigue, was now fainting under it. Of course, not every abuse suffered at the hand of a drill instructor was purely physical. Sometimes, and I'd venture a guess to say probably more commonly, those cruelties would come in softer, less detectable forms, such as in financial abuse. In his 1825 Recollections of an Eventful Life, chiefly passed in the Army, another unnamed soldier describes how, from the day of his enlistment, he was imposed upon by his fellow soldiers who were constantly demanding that he pay for their drinks while in town. Really going through his account with just how many people were constantly demanding that this guy pay for one thing or another on their behalf. It gets quite comical after a while. But for our purposes, when this new recruit is freshly arrived with his regiment, he writes how, "In the course of the day I got my regimentals served out and was sent to drill. After drill, it was intimated to the recruits who had lately joined that they ought to treat, which is to say, to give a gift to, the drill sergeant, as he would not be so hard on us if we did so." Gotta love some good old bribery. All of this, of course, were things that men like Cuthbertson were explicitly warning against, but evidently words of advice which were not necessarily followed in every regiment. Bribery was a big problem, and there's a reason why men like Cuthbertson and Symes were talking so much about why it's important to find NCOs and officers who are going to be above taking bribes, who are sober and good-natured and everything. Well, it's because they're speaking to not describe what the Army really was, they're speaking to what the Army ought to be. So does this mean that in cold, harsh reality that every drill instructor was really a cruel overseer beating his men and taking their pay? Well, no, of course it doesn't. Just as the earlier prescriptive texts don't necessarily speak for the whole army, neither do these few selected accounts of cruelty and abuse. Rather, I think that the majority of accounts not mentioning anything at all about their experiences in drill rather indicates that the majority of instructors simply weren't overly worthy of note. They weren't these perfect Cuthbertson saints, but neither were they, well, that. For example, even an account as depressing as John Robert Shaw's only very briefly mentions his instruction as a recruit under his old Corporal Coggle, and he actually mentions it in a fairly positive light at that. So, overall, it's difficult to make anything like an absolute statement, I mean, really for anything in history, but especially with these kinds of early modern administrative concerns, because so much of it was being handled so individually. Even if I can't give you that easy 1-minute explanation of how exactly an 18th century drill instructor would always behave, because there likely are no such apt descriptions of such a thing, well, I hope that this brief examination of just a few of the pertinent sources can help you better understand the broader issues at play. Remember, again, if you'd like to learn more, then reading these sources yourself is always going to be the best way to get started with an introduction to a time period. You'll find all of them and many others besides, all by visiting the digital library at nativeoak.org. Or you can also learn there, of course, about my now very soon to be released historical fiction horror thriller novel, The Corpse War of 1793, and also about how this channel donates 10% of all its profits to charity. If watching, as opposed to reading, is more your speed, I'll also be sure to link a few of my other videos on related topics in the description down below. There's a lot of them on my channel, you may expect. Especially, for example, if you'd like to learn more about the organization of the British Army during this time, or the role of officers and NCOs within that army. But for now, I think for this video, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you all so much for watching, and particularly to my supporters on Patreon, without whom none of my work would be possible. Remember that if you'd like to watch these videos totally ad and sponsor free, then you can do so on Patreon for just $1 a month. So with all of that, thank you all again, and until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.